Now I'm going to address nonprofits because nonprofit organizations, including government entities and private nonprofit organizations, may have unpaid volunteer workers. Under the FLSA, sorry to be bouncing back and forth between the state and federal laws, but again, most of you have to satisfy both. Under the FLSA, a nonprofit organization can have unpaid volunteers if their work is for public service, religious, or humanitarian objectives without any contemplation or receipt of compensation. So if you're a nonprofit and people agree voluntarily to work in a public service, religious, or humanitarian manner and don't expect to get paid and in fact are not paid, then they're exempt from minimum wage and overtime requirements under federal law. For the student aspect of this, students, trainees, and if students or trainees are interns and they're working for the nonprofit organizations, they may be exempt from New York State minimum wage and overtime, even if they're paid. In other words, if you paid a student intern in a nonprofit organization $10 an hour, they could still be exempt from New York State minimum wage and overtime requirements. So they're not technically a volunteer, but as long as they're a student in an actual academic program, they would not be subject for New York State minimum wage and overtime. The problem then becomes, assuming you're also subject to the Fair Labor Standards Act, which would be true of a nonprofit organization generally, but maybe not a really small nonprofit based entirely within the state of New York that doesn't conduct any interstate commerce somehow. The receipt of compensation of $10 an hour could invoke and probably would invoke the Fair Labor Standards Act requirements, which then means you'd have to pay them federal minimum wage and overtime. The $10 an hour in that example would exceed the $7.25 federal minimum wage, but if the person then worked over 40 hours in a week, you'd have to pay them time and a half. That would be $15 an hour for overtime under the federal law, even though they're exempt from New York State minimum wage and overtime on the basis that they're a student working for a nonprofit organization. Now, to continue the complexity, non-student volunteers are subject to more restrictions under New York minimum wage and overtime laws. And the other note that I want to have is that employees of nonprofits, so people who are paid to work for a nonprofit organization, can volunteer for that organization to do completely different types of work. For example, if you're an accountant for a nonprofit organization and you want to help run a fundraiser, like literally standing at the table, handing out materials to people who come by during an event, then you could volunteer your time to do that, but you could not work as an accountant for a nonprofit organization for 40 hours and agree that once you work beyond 40 hours, any additional time would be on a volunteer unpaid basis.